A moment of fate. Grace. Miller stood motionless at the window of her modest craftsman home in Santa Clarita, California, the late afternoon sun casting long golden rays across the living room's oak floors. The air was heavy with silence, an uneasy calm that followed the whirlwind of arrangements, condolences, and rituals that came with her mother's passing. Today, for the first time in weeks, the house felt oppressively empty, except for the echo of grief that pressed on Grace's chest. Her mother, Elizabeth Porter, had been the center of Grace's world, a resilient widow, known in town for her kindness, sharp wit, and decades spent as an art teacher at the local high school. Only days ago, Elizabeth's heartbeat faltered in the small, pastel-painted bedroom that still held her scent of jasmine and paperbacks. Now, her absence seemed to hollow out the rooms themselves. Grace moved quietly through the hallway, pausing at family photographs lining the walls. In her mother's favorite portrait, Elizabeth's eyes sparkled, full of secrets and silent laughter, as she held a much younger Grace on her lap. The ache of loss was sharp, but Grace's mind was also pulled by complications that came swiftly after the funeral. That afternoon, Grace had met with her mother's longtime attorney, Mr. Howard Lane. He arrived carrying a briefcase and an air of hesitancy. Though it was expected that a will would be read, Mr. Lane said apologetically that there were some irregularities regarding Elizabeth's estate. When asked for specifics, he merely assured Grace that all would be clarified once the paperwork was in proper order. The mystery hung over Grace like a storm cloud. Returning home, she noticed a subtle shift in her own household. Richard, her husband of 12 years, had taken to making unusual phone calls behind closed doors. His 2 children from a previous marriage, Emily, a poised college graduate, and Jacob, a sullen teenager, were suddenly attentive, asking polite yet probing questions about the house, the family accounts, and what Grace planned to do next. The tension in the house was palpable, if understated. Grace caught the way Richard's gaze lingered on the antique mantel clock that once belonged to Elizabeth, or how Emily offered uncharacteristic help in clearing out drawers, always glancing at important-looking papers. Even Jacob, whose interest in family matters was usually passing at best, loitered around the study more often. Yet, Grace could find nothing outright suspicious, just a gnawing feeling that the ground beneath her was slowly shifting. She busied herself sorting through her mother's belongings, boxes of letters, faded photographs, and jewelry handed down through generations. In a velvet pouch, she found the old silver locket Elizabeth wore even in her final days. Inside, a photo of Grace as a toddler was paired with a slip of paper, the handwriting sharp. Protect what matters most. That evening, as California's sky blushed pink with dusk, Richard suggested gathering everyone for a family dinner. The mood was uncomfortably civil. Each gesture and comment was carefully measured, the usual family jokes and bickering replaced by an air of anticipation. Grace tried to convince herself it was only grief amplifying her suspicions. After the meal, as the others lingered in the living room, Grace stepped out onto the front porch, where the air was cooler and mercifully still. She replayed Mr. Lane's words, the newfound attentiveness of her stepchildren, the subtle change in Richard's demeanor. Alone beneath the quiet sky, she wondered, was she imagining things, or had her mother's death changed more than just her heart? She closed her eyes and promised herself to look deeper. Whatever secrets or complications Elizabeth might have left behind, Grace owed it to her mother and to herself to make sure nothing was overlooked or lost in the shadows. The veil of secrets. The days following her mother's funeral blurred into a series of polite rituals and hollow comforts. Grace's craftsman home, so recently a place where guests offered casseroles and condolences, now echoed with a more brittle quiet. Life staggered on. Richard rose early to check emails in his office. Emily caught up on remote work for her marketing job, and Jacob, always half hidden behind his headphones, lounged in conspicuous silence. Yet beneath the surface, Grace couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted fundamentally, as if invisible lines in the sand were being quietly redrawn. Grace's relationship with Richard had cooled in recent years, though the reasons were hard to pinpoint. Perhaps the slow drift began after the kids left for college, or maybe it was the stress after her mother's first heart scare.
I understand.
Richard had been supportive at times, but there was a transactional edge to his kindness, a calculation that caused Grace to question herself. His children had always maintained a wary distance from her, cordial, but never quite warm. Now that distance felt newly significant. One overcast morning, while passing the slightly ajar door to Richard's office, Grace heard the low hum of whispered voices and hesitated. She caught her own name and, unmistakably, the words assets and transfer. The conversation cut off abruptly, replaced by the exaggerated clatter of a keyboard. Heart pounding, Grace slipped away unseen. She told herself not to jump to conclusions, but found her mind racing. Later that afternoon, while searching for a sentimental brooch to wear, Grace noticed a folder missing from the small secretary desk in the guest room, her mother's keepsake drawer. She was certain she'd seen it there after the funeral, a red folder containing old insurance documents and correspondence about the will. Had she moved it herself in earlier days' exhaustion? Or had someone else decided it was out of place? She combed through drawers and closets, tracing her own steps, but the folder was gone. Grace began to move cautiously, watching for patterns. She observed how Emily, always neat and controlled, spent more time lingering near locked file cabinets and handled envelopes with care. Jacob, more clumsy than secretive, left browser tabs open on topics like inheritance taxes and California estate law. It could all be a coincidence, curiosity in the aftermath of loss, nothing more. But in the quiet moments, Grace's intuition whispered otherwise. She noticed small details piling up. Household mail arrived open, even when it was marked clearly for her. Bank statements she expected never reached her desk. At dinner, Emily's questions about family property grew more direct. Have you decided what you'll do with Grandma's jewelry? Jacob, who would normally scoff at such talk, watched his stepsister's careful probing from across the table, only occasionally meeting Grace's eye with a flicker of guilt. One night, near midnight, Grace descended the stairs for a glass of water and paused outside the shadowy den. There, in the blue light of a laptop screen, Richard spoke in a low, urgent voice to someone on the phone. No, it's only temporary. She won't suspect a thing. Once it's finalized, we'll be in the clear, he murmured, before spotting Grace's silhouette reflected in the glass and abruptly ending the call. Grace willed herself to act normal, masking her growing alarm. Instead, she immersed herself in the comfort of routines, watering her mother's favorite plants, sorting photographs, reading through old letters. But her guard was lifted. She began locking away precious items and making mental notes of what was missing or moved. The grief that had once paralyzed her was now braided with a wary vigilance. It was during these days, quiet and claustrophobic, that Grace realized she could no longer assume the best of those closest to her. Trust was a fragile, flickering thing, and in its absence, the smallest gestures became laden with suspicion. The comforting boundaries of home felt porous, vulnerable. The veil that had once separated grief from fear, family from foe, was growing dangerously thin. And as the unease thickened, Grace understood that her mother's death was not merely an ending, but the first act in a secret drama that had only just begun. The stolen will. The following Sunday dawned gray and subdued, mirroring Grace's mood. She awoke before sunrise,
Look,
her mind
I
tangled
know
with
it
doubts
seems like
that refused to
nothing, but you
fade.
have to understand.
As coffee brewed quietly in the kitchen, she sat alone at the table, shuffling paperwork, her fingertips tracing familiar signatures and watermarks as if seeking answers from the past. That morning, Mr. Howard Lane, her mother's longtime attorney, called requesting a private meeting at his downtown Santa Clarita office. The tone of his message was measured but tense. He explained that urgent matters regarding the estate required her attention. Grace, dressed in muted navy, gathered the stack of official correspondence she'd found in her mother's desk and drove through streets glistening with last night's rain. Lane's office exuded old-world charm, lined with framed degrees and photos of landmark cases. He greeted her with a somber nod, then pressed his lips into a thin line as he unlocked a file drawer. He handed Grace a manila envelope. Inside was a scanned copy of her mother's last will and testament, signed, notarized, and supposedly undebatable. But as Grace scanned the pages, a cold sweat broke across her neck. The signature, a familiar scrawl, looked just slightly off. The date was recent, much newer than she remembered, and the language bequeathed the entirety of Elizabeth Porter's estate, not to Grace, but to Richard, her husband. Stunned, Grace shook her head. There has to be a mistake. My mother spoke to me about her wishes. She would never have left everything to Richard. Where is the original document? Lane hesitated, fidgeting with his glasses. Grace, I received this version 2 weeks before your mother passed. It was filed according to standard procedure, delivered by Richard himself. I never had reason to question its validity. But I have to admit, your mother's previous will, which left the estate to you, has gone missing from our secure storage. I discovered the absence the day after the funeral. Grace's hands trembled as she searched her memory. She distinctly recalled her mother mentioning a safe deposit box at the local bank and a set of keys hidden in the pottery studio. Had someone accessed the box before her death? Was Richard somehow involved? The possibilities chilled her. Back at home, that afternoon, Grace began her own frantic search. She tore through every likely hiding place: the safe in her mother's bedroom closet, the hollowed-out art books, the coat pocket where Elizabeth kept her emergency cash. The original will, every copy she could remember, was gone. In its place, she found only emptiness and unsettling signs that someone had carefully cleared them away. Grace's phone buzzed with a new email from Mr. Lane. The message was blunt, her worst fears confirmed. As of this morning, the probate court has recognized the latest version of the will. All assets, including the house, accounts, and valuables, have been deemed property of Richard Miller, per the submitted document. Outside the study, Grace heard the faint cadence of laughter. Richard and the children gathered around the TV as if nothing had changed. Her world was coming apart, but theirs continued seamlessly. Grace fought the urge to burst in and demand answers, stifled by a crushing sense of betrayal and disbelief. She knew the law now stood, at least for the moment, on their side. Instead, she sat down at her mother's old writing desk, lit by the waning glow of late afternoon. She spread out every legal paper she could find, comparing letter forms, scrutinizing notary stamps, replaying every conversation she'd had with her mother about her final wishes. The more she looked, the more certain she became. This was not just oversight or confusion, it was deception. As night crept in, Grace realized with grim clarity that the only truth she possessed was her own memory. And that was not enough to restore what had been stolen. The documents, the proof, the very trust her mother had left her were now out of reach. If she wanted justice, she would have to find it herself, even if it meant standing entirely alone. Her grief transformed. Grief for her mother collapsed into a tempest of outrage. For the first time since Elizabeth's death, Grace's sorrow sharpened into resolve. A fight was coming, not just for money or property, but for the dignity of her mother's legacy and the reclamation of her own place in the world. In the silent house, she began a list: people to question, records to review, secrets to dig up. The theft of the will was not the end. It was the beginning. Embers of hidden fury Grace awoke from a fitful sleep, riddled with fevered dreams, her mother's voice echoing with warnings, the faces of Richard, Emily, and Jacob staring at her with masks half stripped away. Sunlight pressed thinly through the curtains, but the world outside felt distant, muffled, as if she were sealed inside a glass box. The familiar patterns of her life, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the stairs, the scent of coffee brewing, had all shifted underfoot, everything touched by the slow, lingering rot of betrayal. For the first time since the funeral, Grace's feelings refused to settle into sorrow or resignation. Instead, anger coursed through her veins, quiet, hot, and fiercely directed. It ignited in her chest every time she glanced at her mother's empty chair or at the now vacant jewelry box, whose contents had once been lovingly cataloged, piece by meaningful piece. No matter how hard she tried to press her pain away, fury flickered beneath the surface, gaining shape and heat with every small reminder of what had been stolen. Not just money or property, but trust, memory, and legacy. That morning, Richard greeted her in the kitchen as if nothing at all was amiss. He smiled thinly and poured a mug of coffee, making offhand remarks about yard work and bills, his eyes never quite meeting hers. Emily and Jacob moved around the house with exaggerated politeness. The forced pleasantries between them grated on her, every surface interaction an insult to the intelligence Grace prided herself on. Yet she stifled her urge to explode. She couldn't afford the luxury of outrage, not yet. In the privacy of her mother's old studio, surrounded by unfinished canvases and the faint fragrance of linseed oil, Grace allowed herself a moment to grieve anew. She pressed her fingertips across the rim of a clay bowl her mother had crafted by hand, letting the ridges ground her. She breathed deeply, recalling the words scribbled inside her mother's locket. Protect what matters most. For a time, that meant keeping the family together, honoring her mother with grace and patience. Now, it meant something far more urgent, a personal imperative to uncover the truth, whatever the cost. Her thoughts oscillated wildly between doubt and resolve. What if she was wrong about Richard and the children? Was it possible that she was simply a casualty of bad timing and administrative confusion? But every detail, the missing folder, the new will, the whispered conversations, all pointed stubbornly to a scheme more deliberate. "It's not paranoia if you're right," Grace almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat. She began to compartmentalize her grief from her purpose, refusing to let guilt freeze her in place. If she succumbed to fear, she would lose not only her mother's legacy, but herself. So Grace made a pact in that silent, sun-dappled studio. She would show nothing, feel nothing, and learn everything. She would become a shadow in her own house, noting every detail with the careful eye of a stranger. Her first step was to secure what little remained in her control. She retrieved the few pieces of jewelry that hadn't vanished and wrapped them tightly in fabric, hiding them in a crevice behind an old kiln where only her mother would have thought to look. Next, she boxed up her mother's journals and letters, each a patchwork history of a woman who trusted too easily, tucking them into a locked suitcase that would never leave her sight. Grace also sifted through her own legal documents, passport and savings, storing them in a nondescript envelope, wary of the prying eyes she now suspected everywhere. Grace's communication changed overnight. She no longer left envelopes in the open or spoke of private matters within the house. She created a new email account on her phone and transferred copies of every digital file relating to her mother's finances to a hidden cloud folder using passwords she'd never shared. At dinner, when Emily inquired lightly about insurance policies or family heirlooms, Grace responded with pleasant non-answers, feigning forgetfulness and fatigue. Her loneliness grew, but so too did her vigilance. The facade of normalcy wore on her. Richard's affectionate gestures, offering to fix broken steps, bringing her tea, felt rehearsed and hollow. Emily's attention became keener, her questions more circuitous. Grace caught her lingering by the office door, scrutinizing mail before handing it over. Even Jacob, previously indifferent to all but his phone, now watched Grace with troubled eyes. Occasionally, she glimpsed flashes of discomfort and guilt, but Jacob always slipped quietly away before she could confront him. Late at night, Grace would replay the day's conversations, picking apart tone and timing. She noted the dates on bank statements, cross-referenced withdrawals from her mother's accounts with known events. With each discrepancy, a check cashed before the funeral, an insurance policy altered 2 days prior to Elizabeth's death, the knot in her stomach tightened. Yet beneath her analytic drive, the ache of loss threatened to derail her focus. Grace grieved not only for her mother, but for the illusion that her family had ever truly been hers. Loneliness became her constant companion, but it also bred clarity. From this day forward, trust would be earned, not assumed. Her conviction deepened when she ventured, alone, to her mother's grave one gray afternoon. With trembling hands, Grace laid a bunch of irises, her mother's favorite, beneath the headstone. "I promise I won't let you be forgotten," she whispered, her voice unsteady but fierce. "Not by them, not by anyone." In that moment, the scope of her task settled upon her. It was more than an inheritance at stake. It was the preservation of memory and the righting of a profound wrong. The world outside continued as if nothing had changed. Neighbors waved, the mail was delivered, and sunlight filtered over the red-tiled roofs of Santa Clarita. But for Grace, everything was different. Her mother's words became her mantra, echoed each time she padded through the silent house. Protect what matters most. Every act of concealment, every silent observation, was a step toward reclaiming what had been lost. Grace began documenting her days in a small, leather-bound notebook her mother had left blank for future projects. Under the plain cover, she cataloged everything: unusual comings and goings, suspicious emails, odd transactions, even snippets of overheard conversation. The act of writing sharpened her mind and cemented her resolve. Slowly, methodically, her anger forged itself into strategy. While the family planned social outings or watched television as if wielding normalcy as a shield, Grace receded into her own quiet campaign. She phoned her old college friend, Sarah, now a capable attorney, asking to meet discreetly. She started researching legal terms, reading court cases about probate fraud late into the night. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that justice would not arrive on its own. She would have to drag it, kicking and screaming, into the light. She made herself invisible in her own home, blending into routines and giving nothing away. No confrontation, at least not yet. Fury, she realized, was most dangerous when kept below the surface, burning slow and steady. There would be a day for reckoning, for putting the pieces on the table and watching the guilty scramble for cover. But today was not that day. Grace dropped the mask of the grieving daughter and donned that of the quiet hunter. She would protect her mother's name and honor, no matter how long it took. Outwardly, she moved with composure and poise. Inwardly, the flames of betrayal sharpened her senses, fueling a plan that would not rest until every truth, no matter how deeply buried, was unearthed. And so the embers of hidden fury glowed, banked but alive, ready to ignite the path forward. The hunt for evidence.
Oh.
Grace spent the following week sleepwalking through her routines, each day a brittle imitation of the last. But beneath her calm exterior, determination simmered like a live wire. She had made a promise at her mother's grave, and that promise demanded more than silent stewing and careful evasion. It required action, precision, and, above all, proof. The time for guessing was over. On a Thursday morning still glazed with dew, Grace met Sarah Parker at a quiet corner table in a neighborhood cafe near Santa Clarita's courthouse district. Sarah, once Grace's roommate at UCLA and now a respected local attorney, listened with a practiced stillness as Grace recounted the swirling suspicions, subtle manipulations, and chilling details of the stolen will. When Grace shared her plan, Sarah's eyes sharpened with resolve. First, we need to be methodical. Everything leaves a trail, especially fraud, Sarah said, her voice low. We'll look for inconsistencies, missing records, digital footprints, and we keep everything under wraps until we're ready. They arranged a system. Grace would document all suspicious behavior at home, while Sarah would quietly pull public records and contact trustworthy sources in the legal and financial communities. If Richard or the stepchildren attempted to move assets swiftly, it might show up in a bank transaction or a change of beneficiary somewhere. Grace started by scrutinizing the household's everyday happenings with new purpose. She watched Richard more closely than ever. The phone calls, the furtive conversations with Emily, the hours he spent in his locked study late into the night. She observed how Jacob sometimes lingered outside the office, only to shuffle away guiltily when noticed. Every small detail found its way into Grace's leather notebook. But if the villains had become careful, so had Grace. She ramped up her own operational security, installing a sound recorder near the study, setting up motion alerts on her mother's old hobby room, and using a secure virtual drive Sarah had advised her to create. She learned quickly: delete browsing histories, set device passwords, leave no sensitive document in view, store all hard evidence in a secure, fireproof lockbox. The first break came unexpectedly. That Saturday, when Emily was at the gym and Richard had taken Jacob out for burgers, Grace had the house to herself, at least for a short while. She retraced an old memory, pulling her mother's battered recipe tin from the kitchen shelf. Beneath dough-geared cards for lemon bread and pot roast, she found what she was seeking. A small flash drive, the label written in Elizabeth's neat script. Legal, docs. Grace texted Sarah. They met that night, both hands trembling as they plugged the flash drive into Sarah's encrypted laptop. The folder contained PDFs of Elizabeth's handwritten will, dated 2 years earlier, as well as a set of scanned letters between Elizabeth and Mr. Lane. One paragraph stood out in a letter dated just weeks before Elizabeth's final illness. I want my daughter Grace to be sole executor and beneficiary. Please ensure this is updated. Sarah's brow furrowed. This is golden, but we'll need more. These files prove intent and prior wishes, but unless they're linked to legal filings and account movements, the court may still prioritize the latest official document. We need to tie in discrepancies, force the question of who replaced or concealed the will. Motivated, Grace widened her search. She combed through her mother's papers and bank statements, matching transactions against dates when Richard traveled or held business meetings. Patterns began to emerge: unusual withdrawals close to the date of Elizabeth's hospitalization, wire transfers just after, and what appeared to be a new account set up in Emily's name. Meanwhile, Sarah filed a discreet information request through contacts at the county clerk's office, seeking logs of who had accessed Elizabeth's safe deposit box in the weeks before her passing. We'll need to work quickly, Sarah warned during one of their late-night phone calls. If your hunch about Richard is right, He'll be looking to move or hide assets before anyone can freeze the estate. The two women set up a private, secure channel of communication. Encrypted messages, analog signals, mutual code words should anything seem amiss. Grace even began carrying a small pocket camera, ready to photograph any document, screen image, or suspicious package she chanced upon. The next piece fell into place late one afternoon, when Grace intercepted a phone message left on the landline by mistake. It was from a notary public, confirming a rush job performed the month before Elizabeth's death, witnessing her signature on revised estate documents. The notary's tone was brisk but nervous. Grace, pen trembling, relayed the details to Sarah. Sarah dug deeper, cross-referencing the notary records against Elizabeth's travel and medical records. "Your mother was never discharged from the hospital on that date," Sarah noted. "She couldn't have left, much less understood what she was signing. This could be the thread that unravels everything." Emboldened, Grace called in a favor from an old neighbor, Mrs. Donnelly, who volunteered at the hospital's visitor desk. Donnelly confirmed that Richard, Emily, and Jacob had visited Elizabeth several times without Grace present. On 2 occasions, Richard brought in a briefcase and had insisted on privacy with Elizabeth, closing the door despite hospital protocol. Donnelly's recollections were, backed by security camera logs Sarah quietly acquired through a friendly paralegal at the hospital's legal department. The times matched exactly with the dates around the notary visit and with the sudden appearance of the new will. Grace juggled this spinning web with growing exhaustion, but also growing strength. She and Sarah now had a timeline. Richard's suspicious financial moves, the concealed flash drive with Elizabeth's real intentions, the unauthorized notary visit, and irregular access to the safe deposit box. Every new fact was logged, encrypted, duplicate-backed across multiple devices. Despite her progress, Grace remained careful. At home, she continued her mask of formality, even as Richard grew bolder in making household decisions, and Emily became more involved with estate management. Grace sidestepped their attempts to get her to sign legal forms, buying herself precious time. One evening, Grace caught Jacob gazing at her with haunted eyes, as if wrestling a secret. The boy seemed to want to say something, but he hesitated and slipped away. Grace made a mental note. If anyone in the house was wavering, it might be him. Sarah's final advice at the end of the week was clear. "We have enough for doubt, and maybe police interest, but not enough for a criminal conviction. Next step is to record direct admissions, or catch them altering evidence." For Grace, the hunt was no longer just about vengeance. It was about her mother's voice returning, louder each day, urging steadfastness and courage. As the sun set behind the hills, Grace looked out the window and felt a current of resolve surge through her. Step by step, the truth was surfacing. This, she knew, was only the beginning of the reckoning. The masks fall away. Every family wore masks, Grace mused, but in her house, the thin veneer of civility had grown taut, stretched close to breaking. The balance of power and secrets shifted with every glance, every hush that fell at the dining table. She watched Richard's efforts to maintain his role as the reliable husband, the pillar who handled repairs, finances, decisions. Emily adopted a mask of helpful daughter, meticulously wiping counters, organizing paperwork, and volunteering for every chore. Jacob, sullen as always, kept mostly to himself, but Grace noted how the glances he exchanged with Emily grew longer and more burdened. Grace moved through each day as if across a chessboard. Every interaction was weighed and measured for the right moment. Too early would be suspicion without proof. Too late, and everything she treasured might be lost. The tools she and Sarah assembled in secret, audio recorders, note-taking apps, a slimline camera hidden in a fake book, became her silent accomplices. Her biggest challenge was creating opportunities, situations so ordinary, nobody could accuse her of setting a trap, and yet situations that invited the people around her to reveal what was truly underneath their careful facades. She began with small acts. One afternoon, she accidentally left a letter from Mr. Lane about the estate in plain view on the foyer table, then left the house for a quick trip to the store. Upon her return, the letter had been moved, slightly askew. Tiny fingerprints in the dust gave away that someone, Emily most likely, had picked it up and read it. Encouraged, Grace escalated her efforts. She started inviting Emily to help with organizing Elizabeth's remaining boxes, always mentioning missing receipts or old insurance statements within earshot. She paid close attention to what Emily offered to search through and to her oddly specific suggestions. Maybe the guest room closet, Grace? That's where Grandma used to keep envelopes. Emily's eyes sparkled a little too brightly as she spoke, nerves dancing at the edge of composure. It was Jacob, however, who broke first. One rainy evening, Grace found him standing at the window, silhouetted against fat drops racing down the glass. He startled when she greeted him, fumbling with his phone. Grace, gentle as she could, asked if he was all right. After a pause, Jacob blurted out, "Emily says you're making things complicated." He looked at her then, his gaze both petulant and pleading. "We're just trying to get through this, you know?" Grace nodded, her heart twisting. "We all are, Jacob. But that doesn't mean we forget about what's right." He looked away, shoulders hunched. In that moment, she knew Jacob's mask was worn, not rooted in malice, but in confusion and fear. Later, Grace pulled out her old board games from childhood and invited the entire family for an impromptu game night. Richard objected. He had calls to finish, but relented after a glance from Emily. Throughout the evening, as dice rolled and laughter rang false, Grace floated conversation toward the past. Favorite memories of Elizabeth, places she liked to hide gifts, silly stories from when Grace was a child. She watched the others closely. Emily stiffened only slightly, but Richard, for a brief glimmer, looked almost panicked at the mention of the fireproof lockbox in Mom's old closet. He quickly changed the subject. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, Grace reviewed audio from the small recorder she'd planted behind the hallway painting. The device had caught a brief, whispered conversation between Emily and Richard in the kitchen. "Do you think she remembers where the other documents are?" Emily's voice was tense, tight. Richard sighed. "Just keep an eye on her. If she finds anything, we'll handle it, like before." A pause. "What about Jacob?" "He won't say anything. He's scared of losing the house." Grace clicked off the recording, her hand shaking with a complex mix of triumph and sorrow. She had suspected, but now she possessed evidence they were actively monitoring and manipulating her. The mask of accidental family concern had cracked, and what lay beneath was calculation and fear. Over the next days, Grace sharpened her approach. She offered Emily the chance to help craft a memory scrapbook for Elizabeth, purposely asking her to sift through a stack of old bank statements and hospital records. While Emily worked, Grace lingered, sometimes just out of view, watching how her stepdaughter painstakingly sorted through the papers, setting some aside before remembering Grace's presence and offering forced smiles. Then, Grace orchestrated her boldest move. She invited Richard to discuss the estate, one last time, for closure, suggesting they record the conversation for Jacob and Emily's benefit. Richard hesitated, but Grace insisted, claiming it was healthy for everyone to be honest on the record, for healing. Reluctantly, Richard agreed. Grace set up her cell phone, voice recorder carefully angled out of sight, and began gently but persistently recounting her mother's last wishes, and the original will's disappearance. She confronted Richard about the timeline, the locked desk, the changed accounts.
Oh, that
Richard
tickles.
deflected, but as his irritation rose, so too did his arrogance. Feeling confident, he began to boast subtly about how every family has to do what's necessary to secure their future, and dropped hints about how no court would challenge a properly filed document, no matter what people think. At one point, emboldened and a little reckless, he laughed, a dry, cold sound. Lawyers love rules, Grace. As long as the papers are in order, everything's legal enough. Let's not dwell on the messy feelings, okay? His guard, so long maintained, finally slipped. Grace concealed her disgust and gratitude for his carelessness. The next day, Grace sat alone, reviewing the audio and her recent notes. There was enough, she knew, to approach Sarah with confidence, but a sense of melancholy kept her from celebrating. The people she had shared her home and life with, all the small rituals of meals, clinking glasses, bittersweet laughter at the end of a long day. Those had been costumes for a darker scheme. It would never be the same, no matter how the law played out. Yet, as dusk deepened and soft lamplight filled the corners of the house, Grace felt certainty settle in her bones. The masks had dropped. She saw her opponents not only as adversaries in law, but as lost souls tangled by greed and denial. Her path was clear now, not only to defend what was rightfully hers, but to reclaim her mother's memory from the haze of deceit. Tonight, she would not mourn. Tonight, she would prepare, transcribing evidence, setting up her next meeting with Sarah, and making sure, as the world outside drifted toward sleep, that she was ready for what justice demanded. The masks had at last fallen away. The truth, raw, unvarnished, and painful, stood between them. And for the first time since Elizabeth's death, Grace did not flinch. Step by step, the truth unfolds. A heavy silence shrouded Grace's home, broken only by the ticking of Elizabeth's old clock on the mantel, a steady reminder of time passing and secrets eroding. The days drifted into autumn, but the air inside was thick with tension and anticipation. Gone was the tentative caution that had guided Grace's every move. In its place burned a fierce determination, not the blind heat of anger, but a cold, relentless sense of duty, an obligation to her mother and to the truth. After weeks of methodical preparation, Grace and Sarah were ready to act. Each shred of evidence had been sorted and cataloged, each recording backed up thrice over. They had both grown thin and ragged with exhaustion, but behind their hollow eyes gleamed resolve. Now, it was time for the confrontation to leap from whispers in the hall and paper trails hidden in drawers into the stark light of legal scrutiny. Filing the case. They began with a formal petition to the probate court, submitting everything they had: digital files, dated recordings, statements from neighbors and hospital staff, and Sarah's comprehensive written argument. In the privacy of Sarah's law office, the two women pored over every line, mindful that no detail was too small to matter. It was not just a legal maneuver. It was a declaration. They would not be bullied, manipulated, or erased. As Sarah pressed send and the complaint vanished into the digital ether, a tremor ran through Grace, not of fear, but relief. At last, the burden of secrecy was shifting outward, transferring a sliver of weight from her shoulders to the broader machinery of justice. Police involvement. Within days, a detective from the Santa Clarita Police Department reached out for an interview. Grace arrived at the station with Sarah at her side, clutching the well-organized binder of evidence. The detective, calm, inquisitive, and subtly skeptical, listened as Grace explained the missing will, the suspicious bank transfers, Richard's private meetings with notaries, and the patterns of intimidation and surveillance. For the first time, Grace spoke without editing herself. Her voice trembled only once. She relayed, in stark detail, the cold indifference in her household, the calculated games of kindness and control, and the heartbreak of watching her mother's memory handled as a commodity. The detective scribbled notes and promised to follow up promptly. Sarah, ever the strategist, reminded Grace to stay alert and report any attempts at intimidation or destruction of evidence. Ripples in the family. If their suspicions within the household had once been a silent current, the tide now turned tidal. It wasn't long before Richard received his own official communication from the court. The color drained from his face as he scanned the document at the breakfast table. Emily's composure faltered. Jacob glanced between his father and stepsister, bewildered and anxious. Richard confronted Grace that evening, voice pitching between outrage and injured pride. "How dare you drag our family into this mess in public? Don't you realize what you're risking?" Grace's jaw was set. "You left me no choice. You knew what you did." She held his gaze, daring him to deny it. For the first time, Richard had no ready answer. Emily, ever the tactician, tried a different approach. Quiet appeals to the past, half-hearted apologies that stopped short of confession. "We could work this out, Grace. Maybe there's a misunderstanding. Let's not ruin everyone's life over mistakes. Grandma wouldn't want that." Grace simply replied, "Grandma wanted honesty. She wanted me to protect what matters most. I'm doing this for her and for myself." In the public eye. The case did not stay quiet for long. Santa Clarita was a small community, and as word of the investigation spread, the response was swift and sharply divided. Some gossiped, some sympathized, some recoiled in horror that such things could happen even in their quiet suburban streets. A local journalist, eager for a headline, reached out to Sarah for comment. At first, Grace hesitated, but Sarah counseled transparency. "The public can be your ally, but only if they see you as the woman fighting for her mother, not a troublemaker or opportunist. The truth is, your armor." Grace sat for a modest interview, recounting how her mother had spent decades as an art teacher, leaving a legacy of generosity and creativity. "All I want is for her wishes to be respected," Grace said, "and for the law to protect families from those willing to exploit grief for personal gain." Her dignity and the evidence began to shift public perception. Friends and neighbors called with messages of support. Even a few of Elizabeth's former students, now adults, wrote to say they believed in Grace's strength. Richard's defensive plays. Yet, as the investigation mounted, Richard played his own hand. His attorney filed motions to dismiss the case as family drama, claiming the will was clear and legal. He painted Grace as unstable with unresolved grief. Emily and Jacob, coached carefully, maintained their silence in public, but within the house, the tension was palatable. Shattered glass on concrete, light refracted, but never restored. Late one night, Grace heard a whispered argument in the hallway. Emily's voice shook. "I told you we should have handled this differently. She's not going to give up. We're going to lose everything if this gets out." Richard's reply was colder than stone. "Let me handle it. There's always a way to control the story." But now there was no controlling the story, not completely. Grace had allies, both official and unexpected. Mrs. Donnelly from the hospital testified to what she'd seen. Security footage surfaced, contradicting Richard's timeline. And Sarah, unyielding, pressed every angle possible, ensuring nothing was discredited due to technicalities. Grace's steadfast resolve. While Richard scrambled to protect his carefully curated image, Grace felt herself changing. With every call from Sarah, every document uncovered, and every expression of support from those who believed her, she grew steelier. The old passivity, waiting for someone else to fix the injustice, was gone. In the quiet hours, she sat at her mother's old desk, organizing her notes, preparing for the next interview, the next legal step. At times, the loneliness threatened to surge, but then she would remember those lessons whispered during sleepless nights. Protect what matters most, even if you must stand alone. With each step, the truth came closer to the surface. The process was slow and bruising. There were days Grace doubted everything, but every fact corroborated, every story verified, every act of kindness or courage from her supporters chipped away at the grand deception. Step by step, the masks fell. Step by step, the walls closed in around Richard and his accomplices. Step by step, Grace reclaimed her mother's legacy and, perhaps for the first time in her life, claimed her own place in the world, not as a victim, but as a champion of memory, honesty, and love. Justice and honor. The courthouse on Main Street stood like a fortress, its red brick facade and stone steps a stark stage for the next act of Grace's struggle. The California sky was dazzlingly blue the morning the trial began, utterly detached, it seemed, from the charged tension inside. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Sarah adjusted the cuffs of her navy suit and squeezed Grace's hand. "We're ready. No matter what happens, you kept your promise," she said quietly, her voice carrying both comfort and caution. The courtroom filled quickly. Reporters scribbled in notepads and adjusted their recorders. Neighbors, friends, and even a few of Elizabeth's former students took seats among the wooden benches. On the other side of the aisle sat Richard, composed but tight-jawed, flanked by Emily, her posture rigid, her lips drawn, and Jacob, hunched in his suit, trying to disappear into the background. Their attorney flicked through a stack of files, expression unreadable. Grace took her seat behind the polished oak table. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for fairness, entered briskly and called the room to order. The opening statements were brief but pointed. Sarah outlined a story of trust betrayed and a will subverted, while Richard's attorney painted the case as a family misunderstanding, clouded by grief and siblings at odds. It was not until the witnesses were called that the true gravity of the moment settled over the room.
Yes, this is Gloria.
First came Mrs. Donnelly, hands clutched around her purse, her voice steady as she described Richard's secretive visits to Elizabeth's hospital room. How staff were asked to leave, how doors were closed, how paperwork was shuttled in and out. She spoke of Elizabeth's physical frailty during those last days, the clear impossibility that she could have grasped the legal changes foisted upon her. Then came Mr. Lane, the family lawyer. He recounted in painstaking detail the security protocols meant to protect original documents and the disarray discovered only after Elizabeth's passing. "In 30 years, I've never seen a will vanish from our vault," he said gravely. "There is no doubt in my mind that the original was replaced or removed without proper authorization." Sarah presented the digital evidence, timestamps and login records, email trails, phone records linking Richard and the notary, even security camera footage showing Richard entering the bank where Elizabeth's safe deposit box was kept, alone, at a critical hour. Each piece of evidence, once nothing more than a fragment of suspicion, now formed a web that shimmered with undeniable intent. Finally, Grace was called to the witness stand. The bailiff swore her in. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Grace's hands trembled as she began, but her voice, once found, was steady. She described growing up as an only child, her bond with her mother, the fierce love and trust that defined their home. She explained, in measured words, the heartbreak of realizing that trust could be turned against her. "My mother was clear, always, about her wishes. She wanted her life's work, her home, and her mementos to stay with me, not to be bartered away or claimed by those who did not love her." Grace said, tears gleaming but unfallen. Richard was called next. Upon cross-examination, his practiced calm began to chip away. Sarah's questions were methodical, referencing the audio
Thank you for
recordings
everything.
and document dates. Can you explain why you delivered the updated will to Mr. Lane rather than Elizabeth herself, despite her being alive at the time? Richard hesitated. She was very ill. It was her request. I was just helping her, making sure things got done. And yet every witness agrees she was in no state to understand, let alone sign those documents. Do you regret not including Grace in these critical discussions? Sarah pressed. A shadow flickered across Richard's face. Things happen quickly during illness. No one ever wants to talk about death. The notary was next, voice shaky as he admitted to a rush visit at Richard's request, never meeting Elizabeth's eyes, simply witnessing signatures as instructed. I should have asked more questions, he conceded, eyes lowered. The courtroom atmosphere was electric, emotions raw. Emily was called at last. She parried with short, rehearsed answers, but when Sarah presented the evidence of the bank account opened in her name, funneling inheritance money shortly after Elizabeth's death, her grip faltered. Silence stretched, and Emily's mouth moved as if to object. Instead, she lowered her head. I trusted my father to do what was right, she whispered, barely audible. Then came Jacob, the youngest, the most emotionally unformed, could not withstand the pressure. When asked about the folder of documents, he was caught moving on security footage. His shoulders sagged. I just did what Emily asked, he sniffed. I don't even know what some of it was for. I just didn't want everyone fighting.
I felt so alone.
Outside, the trial became a lightning rod for whispers and arguments in Santa Clarita. Neighbors exchanged theories in the grocery store aisles. Old friends sent notes of solidarity to Grace, expressing shock at how greed could twist a family. Some pitied Richard, saying that loss made people do desperate things, but the prevailing sense was one of outrage on behalf of Elizabeth and her daughter. When closing arguments finally came, Sarah's words rang through the room. We honor those who came before us by protecting their wishes, not exploiting their weakest moments.
Here's to us, Sarah.
Today is not about revenge. It is, and always has been, about dignity, about restoring the truth. The judge deliberated for hours behind closed doors. Grace sat between Sarah and Mr. Lane, twisting her mother's silver locket in her fists. Outside the window, daylight faded to gold, and then dusk. The courthouse grew quieter as families went home for dinner, but Grace barely noticed the passage of time. Finally, the judge returned. Her verdict cut through the hush. The court found that the most recent will had been procured by fraud and undue influence. Richard, Emily, and Jacob were found culpable. Richard as the architect, Emily and Jacob as complicit by action and omission. The estate would revert to Elizabeth's prior, legitimate will. Richard's attorney tried to object, but the judge silenced him. Justice is neither for sale nor forfeit, she declared. Grace heard the words as if through water. Tears spilled freely now, but not from grief, from exhaustion and indescribable relief. In that instant, she was not simply Elizabeth's daughter or a wronged heir. She was whole, upright, and unshadowed at last. Outside, evening had settled over town. Sarah and Grace stepped onto the courthouse steps together. The courthouse lights cast a warm glow, illuminating the fresh lines of hope on Grace's face. News crews crowded forward, but Sarah waved them off. Grace's only answer to their questions was to hold her mother's locket tight, the inscription a promise finally fulfilled. Protect what matters most. Justice had prevailed, not just in the eyes of the law, but in the restoration of dignity, memory, and honor for a life well lived and a legacy reclaimed. Renewal. The first morning after the verdict, Grace awoke bathed in a strange and unfamiliar stillness. For weeks, no, months, every dawn had arrived freighted with tension, anger, or dread. Today, however, sunlight washed through her bedroom window without burden. It felt as though the house itself exhaled with her, liberated, slightly battered, forever changed. She lay quietly listening to those familiar sounds, the distant hum of traffic, the mourning dove on the wires, the soft creaks of the old craftsman settling into a new day. For the first time since Elizabeth's death, Grace allowed herself to believe in the possibility of peace. She pressed her mother's locket to her chest, the silver cool and reassuring in her palm. The headlines still pinged her phone, echoes of the sensational trial, community opinion pieces, a handful of anonymous barbs alongside letters of support. But inside her home, the noise receded. The echoing footsteps of Richard and his children had fallen silent, replaced by the unobtrusive rhythm of her own life taking shape. There was, of course, work to be done. Legal loose ends lurked in the form of insurance paperwork, property deeds, and the meticulous cataloging of her mother's vast, lovingly collected art materials. She spent afternoons sorting through Elizabeth's journals and sketchbooks, pausing over each page as if receiving one last lesson in love and resilience. Sometimes she would set aside a sheet of paper inscribed with her mother's neat cursive, "Beauty is in the persistence of seeing." Every time she read that, Grace felt her resolve settle deeper inside her bones. But healing was not a checklist. Some wounds resisted the well-intentioned
This
sweep
isn't
of
over.
victory. She found herself stumbling unexpectedly. A forgotten mug in the back of a cabinet, one of Emily's scarves stuffed behind a chair, a scrap of Jacob's notebook paper wedged beneath the sofa. Each token sent flares of anger or melancholy through her. She learned to let them pass, gently, rather than fight them. Neighbors brought casseroles, cards, and shy invitations to afternoon tea. Grace rediscovered the threads of old friendships she had neglected, first by tragedy, then by suspicion, and the slow slide of isolation. She attended more community art shows, volunteering to curate a small local exhibit in Elizabeth's memory. For the first time in years, Grace saw herself not just as a daughter or widow, but as her own person, a voice, a friend, a creator in her own right. One afternoon in late October, she hosted a garden gathering in her mother's honor. The rosemary shrubs and rose bushes Elizabeth planted years ago had flourished, spilling color and scent into the fading gold of autumn. Former students came, sharing memories and laughter around mismatched tables. They held up Grace's efforts not as a sensational victory, but as a quiet restoration of trust and truth. A few brought their own artwork. Clay bowls fired in Elizabeth's old kiln, sketches done with trembling hands at the back of her classroom. Each story offered Grace a sliver of her mother's legacy shimmering into the future. As the legal wrangling faded, Grace took steps toward restoring her own independence. She cleared out the guest bedroom, turning it into a studio filled with natural light. For the first time, she allowed herself to envision a professional life as an artist, not merely a hobbyist or a child emulating her mother. She applied for a teaching assistant position at the local art center and began compiling a portfolio, the fragments of which finally made sense as a story of survival, resilience, and rediscovered identity. At night, she continued her quiet rituals, journaling, walking the neighborhood, checking on her hidden collection of precious family heirlooms. With everything secure, she no longer needed to padlock memories or scan the horizon for betrayal. The boundaries of her home, though scarred, were secure again. Weeks blurred into months. carrying her farther from the
He's
cycle of
losing
suspicion
consciousness.
and
We need to
loss.
stabilize him now.
Emily, after a single short letter of apology, did not return to Santa Clarita. Jacob sent an awkward but heartfelt email from college, thanking Grace for not painting him as a villain. She replied simply, "Find your own truth, Jacob. Don't let fear make your choices for you." Richard, legally blocked from the estate, moved on. His silence a relief, if not a source of joy. Yet Grace was not untouched by what had transpired. Scars lingered, trust more carefully rationed, old wounds slow to knit. Sometimes, when dusk fell and the house grew quiet,
Any ideas
echoes
on
of
this one?
Elizabeth's voice hovered in the corners or emerged from a favorite song on the radio. Rather than drowning in grief, Grace began to talk back, sharing small triumphs, frustrations, and dreams out loud
let's talk
as she
about what
worked
happened
into the
tonight.
night. As Thanksgiving approached, she invited her closest allies, Sarah, Mrs. Donnelly, and a handful of artist friends, to a simple dinner beneath Elizabeth's old chandelier. There was no talk of the trial or the ugliness of betrayal, only gratitude and the unspoken comfort of chosen family coming together. After the meal, they gathered in the garden and lit lanterns, each letting go of a wish for the year ahead. Grace's floated longest, bobbing gently in the night air. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Mom, for courage and for possibility." Gradually, Grace came to see her mother's locket not only as a symbol of protection, but as an anchor, a portable sanctuary of memory. Where once it felt like a chain, now it embodied the freedom to choose her path, guided but never constrained by legacy. She unclipped a strand of her own hair and tucked it behind the tiny portrait, pairing her future with Elizabeth's faith across time. In the soft chill of early winter, Grace stood by her mother's grave, a clutch of irises in her hand. The ground was cold, but her resolve burned gently. "I am here," she whispered, changed, but not broken. The breeze teased through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and possibility. In that moment, and in many moments to come, Grace understood that renewal was not a return to innocence, but the conscious cultivation of hope, dignity, and honest memory amid the ruins of disappointment. The world had not righted itself all at once, but Grace had found, in the crucible of loss, a self both new and enduring, a daughter, an artist, and a woman who had kept her promise to protect what mattered most. Darkness recedes. Winter deepened in Santa Clarita, gracing the town with crisp mornings and dusky afternoons. The holidays came and went, gentler than Grace expected. No extravagant parties, no echoes of confrontations past, just the steady march of ordinary days. For Grace, each sunrise felt like a door slowly opening, letting in more light and banishing shadows that once seemed inescapable. The change didn't happen all at once. The house was still quiet, perhaps quieter than ever before. And some nights, Grace awoke to the phantom ache of loss, a bittersweet longing for her mother's laughter, for old routines now colored by memory. But these moments were no longer storms. They were passing clouds in an otherwise clearing sky. A month after the legal resolution, Grace found herself establishing new rhythms, ones born not out of necessity or defense, but of genuine desire. She started each day with tea on the porch, watching sunlight bleed across the hills. Sometimes she would write in her journal, reflecting not just on what had happened, but on what it meant to move forward. "Grief is no longer an enemy," she wrote in one entry. "It's the shadow that reminds me I once stood in the light." She took to tending her late mother's garden meticulously, coaxing herbs and flowers from the winter-chilled earth. Each living thing she nurtured felt like a small act of resistance against emptiness. The rosemary grew thick by the fence, irises swayed in the cold breeze, and the rose bushes budded with promise. "You made this possible," Grace whispered sometimes, hands buried in the soil. "Thank you for the roots." With the estate finally and fully settled in her name, paperwork gave way to purpose. She donated several pieces of Elizabeth's artwork and teaching supplies to the local high school, where students remembered Ms. Porter as a mentor who saw possibility in every brushstroke. The principal invited Grace to speak at a small dedication ceremony in the art room. Standing before eager young faces and a mural her mother had designed, Grace spoke simply. "My mother believed art was about uncovering truth, about facing the world, not hiding from it. I hope you'll create bravely. That's the gift she left me. And all of you." Her words resonated through the room, and later, in Grace's own life. Old acquaintances reached out, not with pity, but with respect and curiosity. She took up an invitation to hold workshops at the Community Art Center. The first few sessions were awkward, her voice tentative as she guided students through sketching and ceramics. But as the weeks wore on, Grace found herself loving the gentle authority, the shared focus, and the laughter that surfaced over clay-streaked hands. Sarah became a frequent guest at Grace's home. The two women, once united only by crisis, found friendship in quiet evenings of tea and chess. Their conversations drifted from the intensity of legal battles to musings on ambition, memory, and the echoes of family. "You did more than honor your mother," Sarah told her one night. "You taught the rest of us that standing for truth is never wasted energy, even if the world tells you to stay quiet." For Grace, the greatest transformation was internal. A subtle loosening of the knots wound tight by fear. She found herself singing as she cooked, lingering longer in the sun, and sometimes dancing alone in the hallway for no reason other than joy. She had painted again, sometimes late into the night, losing herself in color and form. The canvases multiplying in her studio were not homages to the past, but tributes to survival. Abstract bursts of darkness giving way to gold, careful studies of hands unclenching, a portrait of her mother drawn from memory and deep forgiveness. The house's atmosphere grew gradually lighter. She repainted the den, opened windows to let fresh air in, and filled empty shelves with plants and bright vases. Where old photographs had once felt like reminders of loss, now they glimmered as portals to cherished eras. Each corner of the house bore the imprint of both struggle and survival. Contact with Richard, Emily, and Jacob faded into the background. There were no more angry voicemails, no legal entanglements, just an occasional formal letter from a lawyer as the last threads of the past were tied off. Emily sent a final card at New Year's, one line written with awkward sincerity. "We all made mistakes. I hope you have peace." Grace read it without bitterness. She replied with a short note of her own. "May you find yours as well." She did not crave reconciliation, but she also did not wish for more pain. The past, for all its barbs, no longer kept her captive. In late February, on a rare, rainy afternoon, Grace made her way to the cemetery. The irises she carried were wrapped in parchment, their purple blooms vivid against the gray sky. Standing before her mother's headstone, she felt the full weight and relief of her journey. "You taught me to protect what matters most," Grace whispered, kneeling to touch the damp earth. "It took me a long time to see that included myself." She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, letting the gentle rain wash over her. The darkness that once seemed endless was now only a memory, a chapter, not a definition. Courage, it turned out, was not a single act, but hundreds of quiet refusals to give in. Grace felt her mother's presence not as a ghost, but as the voice of inner wisdom guiding her forward. As spring approached, Grace lit a candle in the garden each night at dusk, a silent ritual for all she had lost and all she had gained. The flame flickered, fragile but unyielding, casting shifting silhouettes against the stones. Life, after all, was never a promise of ease. It was pattern and disorder, sorrow and exuberance, anchors and wings. In the end, what mattered most was not that the shadows had come, but that Grace chose, day after day, to face the light.